Today we're going to learn about the ideas that actually helped to shape Darwin's thinking. Darwin's voyage on the Beagle came during a really exciting period of history. Geologists that studied the structure and history of the Earth were making new observations about the forces that actually shaped the planet. Naturalists were investigating connections between organisms and their environment. These and a lot of other new ways of thinking about the natural world provided the foundation on which Darwin built his own ideas. So first we have a couple of guys, Hutton and Lyell, and they come up with some information about the Earth being extremely old, and that the processes that changed the Earth in the past are the same processes that operate in the present. By Darwin's time, there was a relatively new science called geology and was providing evidence to support new and different ideas about Earth's history. A couple of geologists, James Hutton and Charles Lyell, formed some important hypotheses based on the work of other researchers and on the evidence they uncovered themselves. They concluded that the Earth is extremely old and that the processes that were changing the Earth currently were the same processes that were done in the past. Hutton recognized the connection between a number of geological processes and the features like mountains, valleys, and layers of rock that seem to be bent or folded. He realized, for example, that certain kinds of rocks are formed from molten lava. Hutton also realized that some other kinds of rocks form very slowly, and sediments build up and are squeezed into layers. The rock layers in the Grand Canyon were laid down over millions of years and were then washed away by the river, forming a channel. Hutton also proposed that forces beneath the Earth's surface could actually push rock layers upward, tilting or twisting them in the process, and eventually forming mountain ranges. Mountains, in turn, could be worn down by rain, wind, heat, or cold. Since most of these processes operate very slowly, Hutton concluded that our planet must be much older than a few thousand years, which is what was currently thought at the time. Hutton introduced a concept called deep time, the idea that our planet's history stretches back over a period of time so long that it is difficult for the human mind to explain his reasoning. Lyell came up with a few principles of geology. He presented a way of thinking called uniformitarianism, the idea that the geological processes we see in action today must be the same one that shaped Earth millions of years ago. Ancient volcanoes released lava and gases just as volcanoes do now. Ancient rivers slowly dug channels and carved canyons in the past just as they do today. Lyell's theories, like those of Hutton, relied on there being enough time in Earth's history for these changes to take place. Like Hutton, Lyell argued that the Earth was much, much older than a few thousand years. Otherwise, how would a river have enough time to carve out a valley? This woodcut from Lyell's Principles of Geology shows geological features near Italy's Mount Etna. Among them is a deep channel labeled B, carved into a bed of lava. Lyell's work helped Darwin appreciate the significance of an earthquake he witnessed in South America. The quake was so strong that it lifted a stretch of rocky shoreline more than 3 meters out of the sea, with mussels and other sea animals clinging to it. Sometime later, Darwin observed fossils of marine animals in mountains thousands of feet above sea level. Darwin realized that he had seen evidence that Lyell was correct. Geological vents, like the earthquake he saw, repeated many times over many years, could build South America's Andes Mountains, a few feet at a time. Rocks that had once been beneath the sea could be pushed up into mountains. Darwin asked himself, if Earth can change over time, could life change too? There were many evolutionists before Darwin. Lamarck, for example, was one of those. So Lamarck is one guy who proposes that species evolved. He just had a different hypothesis. Lamarck suggested that organisms could change during their lifetime by selectively using or not using various parts of their bodies. He also suggested that individuals could pass these acquired traits on to their offspring, enabling species to change over time. Darwin wasn't the first scientist to suggest that characteristics of species could change over time. Throughout the 18th century, a growing fossil record supported the idea that life somehow evolved, but ideas differed about just how life evolved. In 1809, the French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed the hypothesis that organisms could change during their lifetimes by selectively using or not using various parts of their bodies. He also suggested that individuals could pass these traits to their offspring, enabling a species to change over time. Lamarck proposed that all organisms have an inborn urge to become more complex and perfect, and to change and acquire features that help them live more successfully in their environments. Lamarck thought that organisms could change the size or shape of their organs by using their bodies in new ways, like the crab you see in this picture. Lamarck had ideas about giraffes and how they got their long necks. He also used examples like the black-necked stilt, how they could have acquired really long legs because it began to wade in deeper water looking for food. As the bird tried to stay above the water's surface, its legs would grow a little longer. They could then pass this on to the next generation. Lamarck also said that structures of individual organisms could also change if they were not used. If a bird stopped using its wings to fly, for example, its wings would become smaller. Traits altered by an individual organism during its life are called acquired characteristics. Lamarck also suggested that a bird that acquired a trait, like longer legs, during its lifetime could pass that on to its offspring, a principle referred to as inheritance of acquired characteristics. Thus, over a few generations, birds, like the black-necked stilt, could evolve longer and longer legs. Today we know that Lamarck's hypotheses were incorrect in several ways. Organisms don't have an inborn drive to become more perfect. Evolution does not mean that over time a species becomes better somehow, and evolution does not progress in a predetermined direction. In addition, traits that you acquire during your lifetime cannot be passed on to your offspring. However, Lamarck was one of the first naturalists to suggest that species are not fixed. He was among the first to try to explain evolution scientifically using natural processes. He also recognized that there is a link between an organism's environment and its body structures. Another man that influenced Darwin was Thomas Malthus. Malthus reasoned that if the human population grew unchecked, there wouldn't be enough living space and food for everyone. In 1798, during the Industrial Revolution, Malthus said, "The power of population is so superior to the power of the earth to produce sustenance for man that premature death must, in some shape or other, visit the human race." In 1972, the Club of Rome think tank also came up with something similar. If the present growth trends in world population, industrialization, pollution, food production, and resource depletion continue unchanged, the limits to growth on this planet will be reached sometime within the next 100 years. These predictions of doom and gloom on the human race actually ended up giving Darwin some ideas. In 1798, English economist Thomas Malthus noted that humans were being born faster than people were dying, and this was causing overcrowding. This 19th century engraving shows the crowded conditions in London during Darwin's time. The forces that work against population growth, Malthus suggested, include war, famine, and disease. He reasoned that if the human population grew unchecked, there wouldn't be enough living space and food for everyone. Darwin realized that Malthus's reasoning applied even more to other organisms than it did to humans. An oak tree can produce thousands of seeds each year. One oyster can produce millions of eggs. However, most offspring die before reaching maturity, and only a few of those survive to manage to reproduce. Darwin had become convinced that species evolved, but he needed a scientific explanation based on a natural process to explain how and why evolution occurred. When Darwin realized that most organisms don't survive and reproduce, he wondered which individuals survive and why. Artificial selection is something that people do all the time. We choose the traits that we find useful and we breed those into the next generation. Darwin used these ideas to suggest that there was something natural that did the same thing. To find an explanation for change in nature, Darwin studied change produced by plant and animal breeders. Breeders knew that individual organisms vary, and that some of this variation could be passed from parents to offspring and used to improve their crops and livestock. For example, farmers would select for breeding only trees that produce the largest fruit, or cows that produce the most milk. Over time, this selective breeding would produce trees with even bigger fruit and cows that gave even more milk. Darwin called this selective breeding process artificial selection, a process in which nature provides the variations, but humans select those that they find useful. Darwin put artificial selection to the test by raising and breeding plants and some of the fancy pigeons that you see below. Darwin had no idea how heredity worked or what caused heritable variation, but he did know that variation occurs in wild species as well as domesticated plants and animals. Before Darwin, scientists thought variations among individuals in nature were simply minor defects. Darwin recognized that natural variation was important because it provided the raw material for evolution. When Darwin published his scientific explanation for evolution, it changed the way people understood the living world.